Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. So welcome to another, I think, great episode of our Market Access podcast. Today the topic is, and I think we had it also already in the past with various aspects, Canada and the, probably difficulty or complexity of the market access in Canada. And for that, I have today two guests. I have Tara Cowling and Jody Filkowski, both from Melior, but I think probably it would be best if you could introduce yourself firstly. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Tara first, then Jody. Happy to have you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having us on this podcast. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Tara Cowling. I'm the founder and president of Medlayer Health Outcomes Research, a Canadian-based HUR research consultancy. We've been here for 15 years. Prior to starting Medlayer, I actually worked at NICE. I started my career in the UK before coming back to Canada. And we've had the pleasure of working with many manufacturers on navigating the Canadian market access pathway. So very pleased to be speaking about that today. I'll hand over to Jody.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Jody Filkowski. I'm a research lead here in the HTA and Evidence Synthesis department at Medlayer. I've been doing this in this company for about 3 years now. Previous, I have a background in academia as well as research in the private sector. So from big pharma as well as startups, Canadian startups and biotechs, including some pretty serious hurdle challenges in the regulatory side from the pharmaceutical perspective.
Oh, perfect. So I think we have the right kind of, let's say, partners here today in the talk. I mean, before we maybe jump into some of the, I think, key HTA aspects, and I think both of you can probably most likely answer all of those kind of questions. Could you maybe first, let's say, describe a bit, let's say, the market access, let's say, path in Canada, and maybe also, if possible, differentiate between pharmaceuticals and medtech?
Perfect. Absolutely. I'll take on the pharmaceutical and hand over to Jody for the devices because they're very distinct pathways. So from the pharmaceutical perspective, it's quite a path for pharmas to navigate because we have not only a decentralized healthcare system, but we also have many different agencies along the market access pathway. So in Canada, from a drug perspective, it starts with regulatory approval with Health Canada, which is fairly standard for most countries. Then we progress into the HTA review. In Canada, there's two organizations that handle that. There is CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. They do an HTA review for the drugs that are approved by Health Canada for all of the provinces except for Quebec. In Quebec, there is another organization called INES, and they deal specifically with the HTA review process for their province. Following a positive recommendation from CADTH, manufacturers are then proceeded to the PCPA, or the Pan-Canadian Pricing Agency, and that's where the negotiation with the public payers in Canada, the public drug plans, are negotiated. So the opportunity is to negotiate with many of the provinces at the same time through that PCPA process, and then you would do a listing agreement with the individual provinces. So there's a public drug plan in each province that you would negotiate with. INES for Quebec is the payer. So rather, they do participate in PCPA. So sometimes they'll be part of that. Sometimes they'll negotiate separately for the province of Quebec, and they are the payer at the same time. So it's a little bit more streamlined for Quebec. For the other provinces, being part of PCPA is not mandatory, so some provinces may opt out and just choose to negotiate with the manufacturers separately. The final complexity to throw in is private payers. So we have a two-tier system. So once you have regulatory approval from Health Canada, you could go directly to the private payers for listing. However, more often than not, private payers are waiting for the CADTH review first, just to sort of determine the cost effectiveness and what sort of the review from CADTH to help them with their negotiations. However, they obviously don't need the PCPA process or that public payer negotiation. So it is a faster process with the private drug plan. So most Canadians who are employed are on a private drug plan, whereas the public drug plans tend to be for those over 65 or have, certain financial requirements that would allow them to be on the public drug plan in Canada. So quite a complex system from sort of start, of the Health Canada process to actually having access to patients. So a little bit of a navigation that's involved from the pharmaceutical side. We now have just one last little fly in the ointment, Canadian Drug Agency. That was just announced earlier this year. It's been sort of in the works. It will replace CADTH, but how this will impact sort of market access, will it help expedite market access, potentially streamline this process, or even the communications between the different agencies? It's quite sequential. Everyone's waiting to hear more, to be honest. So I think everyone, the views that I've heard is kind of like, could it be, how could this be bad? Because people really aren't happy with the current system in that it's very slow and cumbersome. But we don't really know too much about the Canadian Drug Agency at this time.
That sounds really very complex. And I presume the medtech area, the medical device kind of part is probably not easier, right?
Oh, no, I'll pass over to Jody to walk through that.
Jody.
So to add on to what Tara was saying from the medtech side or the medical devices side, it is more difficult, or I should say rather more ambiguous. So off the top, the only commonality is that anything that comes into the country for approval and use in the human population needs the Health Canada approval. In this case, they're going to issue something called a license, a medical device license, of which there's 4 classes. So devices are spread across those classes based on the risk or the level of disruption they may bring. Things like a wheelchair and a Band-Aid fall into class 1. Easy to get the license. There's never going to be any HTAs or review process for reimbursement on those ones. But as devices become more complex, so say joint replacements or MRI machines or anything that's more risk to the patient, more costly to implement or more disruptive, has an increasing class number. As far as the timing around receiving these licenses, the government in Canada about 10 years ago brought in what they called a red tape reduction initiative. So they're trying to set minimum standards. The minimum standards fall between 15 and 90 days for classes 2, 3, and 4. However, that's not a guarantee. These adjudications are based mainly on the efficacy and safety, so it's not so different from the pharmaceutical side. You have to demonstrate your product is safe, that it has efficacy, that it meets some certain quality standards, and also there will be some labeling issues that need to be addressed at that. After that, it becomes a free-for-all with medical devices. So there's no centralized reimbursement review process like Tara just spoke to in the form of CADTH. There's no formal unity across the country. Our decentralized system really kicks in at this point, and the reimbursement can be decided on the provincial, regional, or even a hospital level for medical devices. Just to put that into perspective, there's about 1,100 hospitals located across 80 health regions and 13 provinces and territories in the country. So in theory, one may have to pursue reimbursement at that level, that disparate level. However, it really depends where your device is used and how useful it is. So something that might be more widely applied across the health system can have a provincial review, which means you don't have to go visit 1,100 hospitals. But if you had a device that might only have utility in certain procedures that are performed at certain hospitals, it may require you to go to a number of different jurisdictions or entities or agencies to look at that. The other thing is that although there is an opportunity to do full HTAs in some provinces and some instances in the country, this is actually not typically employed or used. They will have more of a mini HTA or an HTA-like assessment and reviews, but it's variable as to when they are applied, and there's not a lot of consistency again between them. So you might be prepared to do an HTA, you might even have all your data, but when it comes right down to it, the hospitals or the regions that are reviewing your request might not be interested and might not be willing to employ one of those. There is an instance where not the manufacturers, but the provincial or the health authorities or even physicians within can request or consult CADTH for HTAs or getting feedbacks. These are usually going to be done in the form of an environment or horizon scan, and they're typically done on a device class level, not necessarily for an individual product. So as I started off, yes, devices they're ambiguous and they're more difficult than a pharmacide in Canada, but they are doable. And in some respects, if you want to look at the bright side, there's a lot of flexibility with your market access strategy because you don't have the rigidity of formal approaches. So there is some argument for, I don't know if I call it easier, but definitely you have more flexible system.
Yeah, that's really a lot of information, right? Ultimately, I think what is probably important is I think also the kind of, let's say, provincial kind of differences. That's what I probably take with. I think probably for both kind of, let's say, directions, either for drugs and also for medical devices. But I want to go maybe as well a bit further into the details of the HTA. I've heard that, let's say, for medical devices, I think HTA is not always, let's say, mandatory. It also depends sometimes a bit which kind of weight, which risk class, etc. And sometimes it also might differ a bit from the let's say drugs kind of HTA. But what are the key drivers overall, maybe? And then again, we can differentiate, no problem. But what are the overall drivers within an HTA to be successful in the Canadian market? And I think, Tara, you have just said you also have the NICE experience where I sometimes just say, look, I mean, NICE is sometimes really difficult, but I've also seen that sometimes they are as well pragmatic in a way, especially when you compare it maybe with some other HTA organizations in some other parts of the world.
Absolutely. I think probably the biggest frustration for manufacturers with CADTH is just the overall relationship, and the level of transparency behind the decision-making that happens. NICE, as an example, does have that consultation process during the review. CADTH does not. So it's really, you're getting a review from a reviewer at CADTH, here's a letter. This is, basically our decision and some of the detail behind that. But it's fairly short and there's not really an opportunity for a conversation. So if you're getting a negative recommendation, you're really in a position where you have to generate new evidence and resubmit. There's not sort of as much opportunity. Manufacturers can do a rebuttal letter, but it's limited. That just engagement overall. So the way CADTH have sort of, I think, tried to deal with that engagement piece is by having early scientific advice. And NICE obviously have a very similar process as well. So you have two opportunities for doing early scientific advice. One is very early in your clinical trial development, where you might want to come have a conversation about what you perceive those challenges to be. And then one is much closer to the time of submission. I think part of the frustration is around who is attending the early scientific advice committee versus who's actually the reviewer on that file. So you could be, not to say you're getting conflicting advice, but it may not be as complete as the advice you would get from the reviewer. And then the other challenge that I feel like they have is that payers are not part of that early scientific advice process either. So there's quite a disconnect in many respects they're very siloed, these Canadian organizations. Health Canada and CADTH probably work the most closely together. But then when you think about, the provinces and PCPA, it just seems to be more disconnected. And so a good example for that really comes down to real world evidence, which is very, very popular amongst most countries now in terms of addressing some of the uncertainty from clinical trials. A lot of countries have come out very favorably for real world evidence and how it can complement or support. CADTH in Canada have been very, very late to this. Their position, CADTH's, has been, well, we've always accepted real world evidence, but they're talking about letters from patients or physicians, not necessarily, claims-based analysis studies, to be seen as a valid form of evidence for a submission. So the early scientific advice process now has or invites a real-world evidence kind of discussion. So one of the things, I'd like to see is a discussion around what is appropriate from a real-world evidence is huge. So in terms of what uncertainties from the clinical trials is acceptable to be addressed by real-world evidence, and then what study design would be acceptable to support that uncertainty. And there should be some connection between that early scientific advice and then the review committee to know this discussion happened. This is what, I don't think they're ever going to recommend a study. I don't think they're ever going to say, yes, if you do this, you'll get a positive recommendation, but at least to know that evidence was informed through a discussion with CADTH, that evidence was generated in accordance with that discussion. And that might help carry a little bit more weight when it comes to the review and the inclusion of that evidence for, a positive recommendation. So CADTH are very kind of new in this space versus NICE and some of the European countries, which I think have really established sort of better precedents for how they use real-world evidence to expedite market access. The other recent development from CADTH has been a time-limited recommendation. And so now, if there is uncertainty, right now it's restricted to products where there is very compelling phase 2 evidence, and they have a phase 3 planned, that they can get a time-limited recommendation based off the phase 2, move forward. Now, this is where it becomes unclear in terms of how is the drug funded during this time, but they are allowed a couple of years to complete the phase 3, then come back for a final recommendation. But in theory, there should be an access pathway during the time-limited recommendation. So again, that the funding mechanism behind that is unclear, but that's not CADTH's mandate. They are trying to make moves towards that sort of, it seems to be sort of passing the buck, if you will. Health Canada also have a priority review called an NOCC. So there's conditions, you have to generate more evidence, but it's like a priority review. We'll let it move through the pathway. CADTH are now doing the same thing, time-limited recommendation. We're allowing it to move through the pathway, but still saying there's uncertainty, more evidence is needed to be collected. So this next stage of, the funding in order to get that drug to patients, that still needs to be addressed. But the time-limited recommendation is obviously fairly restrictive. So if you're thinking about rare disease where a phase 3 may not be applicable, you're kind of stuck, because right now the time-limited recommendation, I believe, is really aimed more at oncology. It's really aimed at those drugs where there is a phase 3 planned. It's just going to take another couple of years, but this drug is very promising. There's high unmet need. Let's move that access pathway forward. This is just the problem with Canada, though. They all have their mandates. So even though Health Canada has expedited it, they can't expedite CADTH. So it took several years. Now CADTH have an expedited pathway, but it's still not funded. So now this is the next, it just sort of passed the buck down the chain. So I think that's something that this lack of clarity and these sort of siloed organizations, I think, can be very challenging for manufacturers compared to the UK and the European countries where these pathways are just more established. I think there's just more clarity around those processes and sort of, what they need to do for that market access pathway. The needs of these organizations in Canada are quite different. What the evidence CADTH is looking for is almost more academic. It's pure HTA. The payers in that PCPA process are pragmatic. They're really focused, obviously, on, more of that budget impact kind of component, because really the drug budgets sit with each province. Each province decides what they can or cannot afford to fund. So it's a very not disjointed process per se, but there needs to be some better alignment between the HTA decision and then the payers. Like in the UK, as an example, if NICE recommend a drug and say that it's cost effective, the NHS is just going to take that and go, okay, this is the price. This is the cost effective price for this drug. We'll now go ahead and negotiate with the manufacturer based on that assessment. CADTH can come out and say, this is a cost effective drug at this price, and the payers will still negotiate on a cost effective drug price. So just figuring out how does that work? How do CADTH recommendations, especially if they are saying a drug is cost effective, how do they become maybe more mandatory for implementation? But we have a defederated health system. So you have these individual provinces that say it may be cost effective from CADTH's perspective, but we cannot afford this drug in our province. So there's definitely a lot of complexities for Canada when it comes to, again, the defederated health systems. You've got the individual provinces, but then you also have these individual agencies, and trying to streamline this process, because at the end of the day, it's about getting patients access to medicine, which is vitally important. And I believe we're 19 out of the 20 OECD countries for the slowest access. And in my opinion, that is because there is just so much siloing, so much segregation. So we really need to think about how we can, optimize and streamline these processes to allow patients, and Canadians at large, to be able to access these innovative therapies.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you also laid it out, I think, quite nicely, and also, and especially compare it versus the situation in the UK. I would assume, Jody, that this is probably not, let's say, too much different, let's say, from an outcomes perspective, meaning from, let's say, having access to, let's say, the innovation in terms of medical devices when speaking about those kind of products. I think the system, is different. I think CADET is not there, but I think ultimately, I think when you said as well, let's say HTA might sometimes apply, but not always. And I think also, let's say, the direct sales to provinces or hospitals or whatever is generally, let's say, a bit more open, if I could say like that. But ultimately, I think you still have the kind of issue, obviously, that, let's say, maybe you don't have the resources and hence you're basically selecting as well individually, let's say, from maybe call it willingness to pay or willingness to fund, whatever it is, for the different provinces. So ultimately, you might have the same kind of issue. Is that correct, or am I wrong somewhere?
Yes, from the device perspective, yes. Most of what you said does have applicability, and it is true. So again, just to put this in perspective, we've already established that we have this undefined, non-formal system for the medical devices. It lacks consistency across the country. It even lacks consistency across jurisdictions, maybe within one province. It's inefficient, it's difficult to navigate, but it's absolutely necessary. So unlike medicines and pharma, which Tara was speaking to, 70% of device reimbursement is actually dispersed by the health authorities and the hospitals. So that's a lot of money to be captured or cost to be captured. So there is going to be some, I don't say necessity to navigate the system, but as a manufacturer, it's probably in your best interest to figure out how to navigate this system. And you're right, we don't have the HTAs that are applied are done so, again, informally. Sometimes they're mini versions or abbreviated versions of full HTAs. The other thing to mention is that these are very cost focused. So whereas we're talking about value-based medicine and really emphasizing value-based outcomes from the pharma side, it still tends to be more cost focused on the devices side. And this is can be especially difficult given that the procurement is who drives these decisions at the regional and hospital levels. And since they are risk averse, they don't necessarily like change. They're heavily focused on cost, so they don't necessarily recognize the value in value outcomes. And many times there might not be a comparator product, which makes it even more difficult for them to adjudicate and make their decisions based on the criteria that they deem most important. So that's, to answer your question simply, yes. Focus more on the cost side. It can be hard to convince them of value. We're not saying the value is not there. We're not saying that the value shouldn't be recognized. But the difficulty is with modern medicine and certainly technology is many times it is value. There's better outcomes, but it's more expensive. So like I said, it could be an uphill battle. The other thing, because this is based or because these decisions typically fall to procurement, there is a use in certainly some of the larger provinces. There's been this push towards using group purchasing organizations and shared service organizations. And that can also make it difficult, certainly for the smaller manufacturers. So larger ones who are more established and maybe more familiar with this process have stronger negotiation powers that they can use or utilize when they're trying to get their devices into practice. However, this can be difficult for the smaller ones. Also, because manufacturers have to actually speak right to the individuals, and sometimes it can be the physician, the actual physician they want to use their device. It can be difficult for them to find these key people or key personnel or key agencies that they need to speak to, departments, whatnot, within the regional authorities or the hospitals. And then the final thing that's, again, different from the pharma side is that adoption or implementation of a particular drug or a new class of drugs isn't so disruptive to standard of care. So we switch out drug A for drug B because we think the outcomes are better. There's minimal disruption to what's happening on the patient level or even the prescribing level. Devices, the opposite is usually true. So to implement a device, you will have to disrupt some physical, tangible standard of care. And this is antithetical to the health system, any health system anywhere in the world. How do you bring in innovation, pilot innovation, or adopt innovation without reducing the service that you're providing to the people or to the population? That's something that is, and it should be, it's not tolerated. It's intolerable. And that's why I think health system transformation is difficult in Canada, but it's difficult everywhere because this is that added layer of innovation and adoption can be difficult to weave in from a physical perspective. But then if we start layering in the cost of implementation for budgets that are typically very strained, at least in this country they are, it can be difficult. It's a massive barrier or hurdle that manufacturers can have trouble getting through to get their device into practice and into use in our health system.
Got you. So it's not getting easier, right? But maybe what I would like to know as well to take out maybe two kind of examples. I think one is in the drug area. I would like to, let's say, get a bit of a deeper understanding of the ATMPs. If I would follow, let's say, what I've heard now, I mean, most of the ATMPs, especially let's say the CAR T cell therapies, especially the first ones, they haven't really had, let's say, strong clinical evidence. If you follow the, let's say, evidence-based medicine kind of criteria, right? A lot of those basically had single-arm trials, small patient, or let's say sample sizes, etc. And I mean, if I follow the kind of issue with the real-world evidence plus the kind of, let's say, funding, which is unclear for, let's say, also when you have maybe a decision for a time-limited kind of recommendation, I would probably, or let's say I could foresee that ATMPs are rarely used in Canada. If I want to add then as well the kind of equity across the provinces, it might be a very difficult situation, isn't it? Or is that maybe totally different and maybe there's a special solution for those products?
I completely agree. I think, the traditional pathway right now is not really set up for those types of medicines. And there's definitely a lot of awareness of that. And to your point, you're right. Like with the time-limited recommendation, it doesn't necessarily help those products because it really is aimed at those that will have full phase 3 evidence and kind of go through the normal pathway. So really at this time, this moment in time, there's sort of two mechanisms. One is called a PSP or a patient support program. So after regulatory approval, the manufacturers at their own cost can start enrolling patients in a patient support program and offering them this product essentially for free in order to gain more evidence on the use of these drugs and then really go and have those negotiations with the individual payers as needed. So if you don't get, as I say, if you don't get a positive recommendation from CADTH, if the evidence is considered insufficient, and with these drugs where it's very high cost, as well as very high uncertainty, and they don't qualify for a time-limited recommendation, they probably aren't going to get a positive recommendation from CADTH. So at that time, your options are really obviously working with the private payers to be able to get this drug to those patients that are on the private plans. But a lot of these, and I'm thinking about CAR Ts where, and some of these really specialized medicines, they probably are going to be on the public drug plans, particularly because of how they're administered. So I think this is an interesting space right now, especially with how many innovative products we know are coming in the next 10 to 15 years. So there's also this sort of discussion around pharmacare in Canada, and for these very expensive drugs where actually not a lot of patients need to take them. Should that burden be sitting with individual provinces to pay for them, or should there be more of a nationalized approach to ensure that there's more equitable access? So this is, I would say, something that is very much on the radar in Canada, is how are we going to deal with these types of products as they come to market? Right now, my understanding is, manufacturers have that patient support program avenue that they can take while they're waiting to get that approval to be listed. So they can actually, start gathering some evidence of how well their drug does work with patients. There's a lot of discussion between manufacturers and CADTH whether that PSP data should be allowed to inform decision-making. It's seen as a very highly biased source of data because obviously it's only the patients that are getting the drug, it's not comparative, and it's being generated by the manufacturers without necessarily all the rigor of a clinical trial. So there's just a lot of uncertainty in this sort of space. One of the things that we know does happen in Canada, but there's no transparency around it, is outcomes-based agreements. So, if you're in a situation where you have this high cost, high uncertainty, but high promise, and you do want to get these drugs to patients, individual outcomes-based agreements can be negotiated with the individual public payers. It has been done. It will probably continue to be done. There is a lot of movement that a more sort of centralized OBA process should be put into place by PCPA to allow at least some transparency around the framework of how should these be negotiated, what should it look like, what are best practices. There's obviously on an individual level a lot of confidentiality with the manufacturers, so the exact details probably can't be publicly shared, but the overall framework and best practices around it, because with those sorts of specialty drugs, they're all probably going to require an OBA. There's just no way to get the evidence to be at this more traditional level that the HTA bodies are used to seeing to meet those needs. So there's got to be more innovative agreements. And we've certainly seen that in the UK and the European countries, where they've got those processes in place, like the Cancer Drugs Fund, in the UK. So I think this is something but that includes funding, right? And that's what's critically important. They are publicly funded during that process of data collection. We don't have that mechanism in Canada. And so that's where, there's this sort of disconnect still within Canada, is how do we provide public funding during sort of a period where that additional evidence is being collected, and
Gotcha.
for these types of drugs at more of a national level and not a provincial level.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, interesting. I think I was just thinking when you spoke about real world evidence and let's say the kind of evidence based and probably more the kind of RCT driven HTA kind of evaluation. I think we have quite similar, let's say, kind of evaluation, maybe call it method guide in Germany, where let's say normally RCT is the only thing to follow, right? Interestingly, we have all 18Ps available in Germany, right? And so let's say the whole kind of system moved a bit and just said, time limited, you need to as well, some even need to run specific registers or come with further kind of data, not necessarily RCT. So it is interesting. Some systems might, let's say, be a bit more adaptable also to those kind of new therapies where it might be tricky maybe and difficult to run large RCTs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is what Jody was saying as well. And I think there is, in the health space, there is a lot of risk aversion, and you can understand it even if you put the costs aside and can we afford this drug and what is the budget impact of this drug? There is still uncertainty in evidence. Is this safe? Does it work?
Exactly.
So you understand sort of this tension that's there when it is in the health space around, the risks for patients, making a drug available that turns out to be, and there's obviously been past precedent of that. And I think that's always sort of top of mind. But I think where we're getting to is understanding these are, if there's no alternate therapy, if these are life-saving, life-changing therapies, like they have to meet this sort of level of criteria, to qualify. We can't put every product that comes to market through this type of process. But how do we identify those that are worth the risk? And then, developing that process to allow patients to access it faster. And I think, the data collection and the almost like, a funded phase 4 where they're, you're following these patients, making sure that it is effective. You're only paying for the outcomes when they are achieved. There's rebates there if they don't. But I think one of the challenges that I've seen, especially with gene therapies, is these OBAs probably need to be put in place for 10 to 15 years, not 2, right? And that's a huge disruption as well. It's 2024. Can we do 10 to 15 years of prospective data collection? Yes, quite cost effectively. I think one of the challenges I've seen in European countries with registries is dropouts. Right? Patients stop participating. So we've talked about in Canada quite a disruptive solution, which is rather than it being between the payer and the pharma, the patient and the payer. The patient signs up and is obligated to provide their data in order to access this drug. And it's a different way of looking at these innovative therapies and how do you ensure that you are, mitigating those risks from the public purse, in these publicly funded health systems, because otherwise, if you are paying for these, incredibly expensive drugs without ensuring that they're effective, as taxpayers, that's a real risk. So that's where I think we're likely to see a lot of modernization and innovation in market access, not just from the processes, but even from like, who are we engaging in this? Rather than this being something that happens to patients, how can they, for these types of therapies, really be brought into the negotiation of like, this is what we're dealing with. This is the uncertainty. And, where does the sort of engagement lie? And should it even be with the pharmas? Maybe not.
Yeah, no, very, very good point. Absolutely, fully agree. So moving again back to, let's say, specific kind of products, this time in medical devices. I mean, when we speak about digital health, what is the kind of process also that in Canada? And digital health is obviously broad, right? I mean, I could very well imagine, especially, let's say, in a country like Canada, that, let's say, digital health monitoring should be a way to go, not even in the future, but probably and hopefully already now. The same with some of the digital health apps. Is anything like that already applied? And how does, let's say, reimbursement / funding work for these, if at all?
So, yes. Canada is into digital health. From a business perspective, the digital health market was valued at about $17 billion in 2022, and it's expected to surpass $66 billion by 2030. So in under 10 years, that's almost a 3 to 4-fold increase. A lot of that is going to be driven by monitoring devices, wearables, and the apps associated with running those. So yes, as you mentioned, this is a space we're in. It's a space that's growing. It's being adopted. The Canadian government does recognize this. So as early as 2018, they felt that the adoption and use of digital health technologies had the potential to make delivery of healthcare more accessible, convenient, and cost-effective. So they have worked that into their task groups and their mandates to consider digital health and the associated technologies going forward. What we have now, I mean, the most obvious one that people think of when you talk about it is the telemedicine or the easy access. This is excellent for our country. We have second largest country in the world by land mass. We have a relatively small population that goes with that, with just under 40 million inhabitants. So we are spread out. It's not cost effective for us to have highly specialized centers or even specialists in even every urban center, let alone every urban center that's small or rural area or province for that matter. So telemedicine and the ability for people to connect with their service providers across the country is important. And it's something that's modern and new, and it is being utilized for sure. So nearly 60% of Canadians have accessed virtual care within the past year. Of the 40% that didn't, half of them didn't do it because they didn't have a need, and only 10% said that they didn't think the virtual appointment would have been appropriate for their concern. So that means upwards of 90% of healthcare interactions have the potential to involve some degree of telemedicine. I spoke about minimizes the effects of remote living. It also makes things more efficient for chronic care because lots of times you have to have some regular check-in with your specialist, but there's no physical interaction that's necessary. And it's easier for consultation. So we have in this country, our specialists, you don't just walk in and ask to speak to. You have to be referred to from a GP. Again, these can be remote. There's going to be some upfront consultation, and you don't physically want to get there. Like I know that I have to frequently go 200 kilometers to meet certain specialists for my family, and it is an inconvenience. So that coupled with the EMRs and the medical records, which is also a form of digital health, which is increasingly being adopted in Canada, although at different rates across provinces, makes it much more convenient to access care than it has ever done in the past. Also with this comes to patient engagement. So again, on health records, we have a lot of portals and accesses that are being developed. Again, different rates of adoption in different provinces, but this is allowing the population to be more engaged in their healthcare, which is important. And to throw another statistic out there, only about 10 to 15% of the people think it is 100% the responsibility of their healthcare provider to keep them healthy and alive. That means 85% of the people have assumed or will be willing to assume some responsibility in their healthcare, and giving them access to all their data, because it is their data, it came from them, they should have ownership of it and agency over it, is a big improvement and a big innovation that really, I think, will help keep people hopefully healthier, if not alive longer, but healthier while they're staying alive longer. And with the respect of the devices, yes, it adds to that improved monitoring and also building that database, building all the data points and the health information that can be used to make future decisions for future people or populations. The advent of wearables has brought added value to this. And these are devices. So just like a Band-Aid might need a license from Health Canada, wearables will need some sort of license too. Again, with that risk and disruption structuring to the licensing, they may fall under that class 1, where it isn't difficult to get a license and you don't need to worry about so much about the reimbursement pathway. However, if you have a device that maybe is implanted that collects some sort of physiological metrics, that's going to require a higher risk, and you're going to get, not necessarily forced, but you can choose to go down that pathway for reimbursement from the regional health authorities. From the challenges side, so we spoke about how valuable digital health and how it is definitely being adopted and being implemented in Canada. There are challenges to this. Again, our defederated or our decentralized system. So as I've said 3 times now, I believe the adoption of digitalization across the different jurisdictions is happening at a different rate. So when you move provinces or when your specialist isn't in the province that you live in, you may have difficulty accessing your data or at least having a complete data set for your GP or say your home care to access. So that can be a bit of a problem. The health systems in Canada don't speak to each other. maybe in some instances, but even when they do, I wouldn't say that it's very efficient or very good. And that just comes down to healthcare being regulated on a province by province level. Like they do see themselves as separate entities, so crosstalk between them can be difficult. Digital literacy and infrastructure is also a bit of a challenge. So technological access, we do have marginalized populations that might not have access or cannot afford devices that aren't necessarily covered. Also, the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure you may need in place to access your data or to even communicate the data coming from your devices or any form of digital health might not be affordable or accessible in certain regions. So that's a bit of a challenge that needs to be addressed or should be considered. And then the big one is really coming around the privacy and security. So anything that is remote monitoring, data generating, data accessing, so that whole digital health space needs to be regulated. We do have regulation in place. I mean, in 2016, Canada recognized the Digital Charter. Again, this is not health specific. It's just a code of conduct, more or less, for all digital innovation and digital activities in the country, of which health would fall under. So it is something that's on the government's radar. They are trying to come up with practices and regulations around this. There's a heavy emphasis on data security measures for any group, even us. Like we work with data, we have some serious security measures that we have to implement when you're handling, accessing, or reporting any data that is from generated in a health setting. And there's a heavy focus, I say, there always has been, or at least for the last several generations, on consent. And that has become even more apparent now with the digital health and the advent of its implementation, is that we having more consent and patients need to understand exactly what they're giving up, what could be accessed, and how it may be used.
Yeah, no, perfect. I mean, I probably could speak even longer with both of you on both kind of topics. I mean, it's so, let's say, fascinating and also interesting to see differences, but also sometimes commonalities, sometimes where maybe things are, let's say, still moving a bit better than in some parts of Europe. Just need to see access to telemedicine, just as an example, right? But a couple of other things. Sometimes we see, let's say, quite similar kind of, let's say, directions. Sometimes you might have rather bigger issues than we have, if I would say from European perspective. Sometimes it's the other way around. Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks a lot. I think there was a lot of information. I think everybody probably will learn a lot, whoever is, let's say, listening to the episode. I learned a lot. So thank you both again, and hopefully to see you both soon as well in person.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So 2 topics in a way what we have discussed in one episode. The overarching one is obviously Canada, but we have discussed today with Kara and Jody about pharmaceuticals and also medical devices. I think what has been clear during the conversation and the talk with both is that Canada is very complex. I think it has a lot of different layers, a lot of different stakeholders, and even more kind of processes. However, I think if you want to be successful in that country, in those provinces, for sure you would need to have a clear and decent understanding of the various pathways. On top, also very important, even that we don't have the answer yet, I think there's even a kind of replacement for CADEX, for example, in the drug area, but also in the medical device area. There might potentially be one or the other kind of change in the next couple of weeks or months. I think also important to, probably what I have as well said to both of them after the kind of episode recording, is sometimes we see some, let's say, similarities between Canada and most European countries. Sometimes you see differences, and sometimes you see some advantages, what is happening maybe in Canada a bit better, like telemedicine access, and sometimes it has as well, obviously, the advantages to maybe live in one or the other European country. Think about access, for example, to new and innovative drugs in Europe. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast, provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.